All right, nerds, I am here with Bill King from the great state of Texas, who has been on the channel before. We are not going to talk about forward party stuff on this live stream. We might do that again soon, but for this conversation, it's really about China because I was curious what Bill was up to, and I noticed, oh wow, he's writing a lot of stuff about China. And given how hot of a topic that is in terms of American foreign policy, I thought it'd be fun to sit down and have a convo about it. I know it was the most commonly referred to foreign country in last week's GOP debate. So clearly it's on a lot of people's minds. And so welcome to the show, Bill.
Nice, good to be back. Appreciate the invitation, Tom.
You bet, you bet. And I should state up front, I have a very specific background and perspective and maybe some bias here. So I'm an American born Chinese. My parents immigrated from Hong Kong, but their parents were very much part of the Nationalist Party in mainland China before and during the Civil War, and they were on the losing side, and many would argue were persecuted by the Chinese Communist Party. So my family's generally a little bit skeptical of the CCP, but obviously ethnically, I have Chinese roots, so that's just putting it all out there. Bill, when did you start getting interested in Chinese history or Chinese policy regarding China?
I had some Chinese clients back in the late 80s, early 90s. They were very interesting group of folks. They they had factories. They bought pelts in the Pacific Northwest.
Mm,
They shipped them to China, manufactured mink and other kind of fur coats, and then sold them primarily in Japan.
mm,
That was their business, and they did very well at it. And so, and they had, but they had actually migrated to the United States and had U.S. citizenship and actually lived here in Houston. So how I met them and knew them. And so they went over there back in around, I guess it was maybe 92 or something like that, for 3 weeks and asked if I would like to go with them as their guest. And so
mm.
I spent 3 weeks touring around China with Chinese. I mean, I was the only Anglo in the group and the only non-Chinese speaker. I went and took like a 6 week cram course on Mandarin before I went, which was not a complete waste of time, but pretty close to it. I was never able to get the intonation down correctly.
My
But
kids say the
anyway,
same thing.
yeah, the uh, I saw that for the first time, and it's just such a incredible experience.
Mm,
It's like you've gone to almost like you've gone to an alien planet or
yeah,
something.
yeah.
But I was amazed at how industrious the people were there, and in '92, especially the degree to which they had adopted market, incentives and were starting
Hmm.
businesses and doing all sorts of interesting things. And I came back just fascinated with it. A few years later, Kissinger wrote his book on China, which is called Kissinger on China. It's like 900 pages long, and took me like 6 months to read or something. But and it really opened my eyes to how fundamentally different the American experience and the Chinese experience is, culturally, history wise. The philosophies, what drives the two countries. It's so different that I think it's really hard for Americans to relate to Chinese. I think it's hard for Chinese to relate to the American experience. And so ever since then, I've sort of viewed with a little bit of a jaundiced eye any like simple explanations about China that, the Chinese communists are bad people, or, they're trying to take over the world, or, China's going to become a democracy like America. All these,
Mm.
sort of grand themes that you hear all the time that the media tends to drive. And just from Kissinger's book, I learned, and then follow up reading about it, that it's just a lot more nuanced and complex than the average person understands, I think, in America. And certainly a lot more complex than our political dialogue allows for. So I decided to write a series of articles on China, kind of challenging these simplistic narratives. Um, and and I've gone three now, and I've got a couple of more I want to do before it's over with. But my basic sort of step back and say kind of the spoiler alert what my view is. I think that I think that China pursues its own self-interest like any country does. In some cases, their interests are adverse to ours. Some they're not adverse to us. I don't think they're out to hurt America or take America over, but they're not going to be they're not benevolent towards us. They're not going to sacrifice something they see as their self-interest. And they see the United States as actively trying to keep them from doing things they want to do. And so I think you've got to look at it in that context. I also think that um, the view of China as being this growing power that's sort of, taking over the whole world is just dead wrong. I think China's power is probably pretty close to its zenith right now.
Mm.
And I think that China's probably in for a long term decline in its influence around the world. And I think we're beginning to see the beginning cracks of that right now in the Chinese economy.
Yeah, I'm curious about your thoughts on how different the two countries are because I actually see some similarities from a national pride point of view because I think in my reading of modern Chinese history and maybe 19th century stuff, they were kind of treated like a colony and pretty much exploited by the European powers. With the Opium War and stuff like that. And that's how Hong Kong obviously became a colony. And so I do sense like within the Chinese perspective that they really feel like, hey, we were kind of kicked around and we want to be treated like a great power. And I think the US, we also have great pride in our origins and kind of standing up to actually the same colonial power, and kind of finding our own standing in the world. Do you see a different like what do you see as any similarities between the U.S. and China? Where do we have common ground?
I think there's some of that, but we in China share that with a whole lot of other countries in the world that came out of
Yeah.
the colonial era. I think the big difference between the United States and China culturally is, first of all, their historical perspective is 5,000 years.
Mm.
Ours is two or 300 years, 400 years at the most. And so, Kissinger's book starts out with this story about how Mao was having some problem with the Indians on some kind of border dispute. They were trying to decide if
Hmm.
they were going to send troops or they're going to ignore what they were going to do. And he had all his national security advisors together. And somebody in the meeting brought up what a Chinese emperor had done in the 1400s with a similar problem. And Kissinger makes the point, we've got no analog for that. I mean, for us to, he said, and nobody in the room thought there was anything unusual about referring to something that had
Mm.
happened 600 years before. Here we don't have any analog for anything that even vaguely relates to that. So the tremendous difference in historical perspectives, just in terms of how long it is, how long their cultural memory is. The second thing that I think people don't understand is that for the vast majority of China's history, they have been either the dominant or one of the dominant, predominant countries in the world. They were one of the richest, most technologically advanced. It was not really until the Industrial Revolution, which
Mm.
for some reason they sort of missed out on, that anybody was really capable of challenging them, as far as being one of the premier countries in the world. And so, you know, um, China, by the way, was never a colonial power. Never in its history was it a colonial power. And it was sort of this attitude that why would we need to go anyplace else? We live the word means the center of the universe. I mean, they viewed themselves as, why would you want to live any place other than this wonderful country that we have, and that's been sort of their attitude. And the Chinese are really obsessed with two things, in my opinion. One is being invaded. They have the longest contingent border with other countries in the world, and they have fought war over war after war after war after war with the people in that region, most of whom were trying to invade China and take over its riches. If you go look, China really has not done a whole lot in invading its neighbors,
Mm,
other than for some kind of security reasons. We want this because, and they've tried to exert influence around the countries around them, but without actually going and taking them over, like Britain did, for example. And so, they went along for millennia with this sort of superiority complex that, they
mm,
were, we're the best there is. And then all of a sudden they had this tremendous decline in what they call the century of shame, which involves the opium wars that you mentioned too, and so forth. The other thing that I think people don't realize, their obsession that the Chinese have is with internal order. And the reason for that is the country has been racked by civil wars over and over and over throughout its history. Bloody, terrible civil wars. There's a book by Steven Pinker called "The Better Angels of Our Nature," and it's a document. It's a book that documents the decline of violence throughout human history. It's a very counterintuitive notion that most people say, well, that can't be right. But when you go back and look, the incidence of violence in terms of the world population today is by far the lowest it's ever been in the history of the world.
mm,
I mean, by orders of magnitude. And one of the things that in his book that he used to demonstrate this is this table that shows the worst wars in history in terms of the absolute casualties and the casualties as a percentage of the world population at the time. 6 of the 30 wars were Chinese civil wars I'd never heard of until I read the book.
mm,
Now you think we've had one civil war in this country, and it still casts this big shadow over the country. Our Civil War doesn't even come close to making that list of the 30 worst wars in world history. They've had 6 of them that have occurred in their history. And so, and by the way, that doesn't include the Cultural Revolution, which killed a bunch of people. It wasn't enough to make the list, but all still really awful. So Confucianism, in my reading of Chinese history, was sort of a reaction to all this internal disorder and strife and all these warlords and everything, because it's really a philosophy. Some people call it a religion. Some people think it's not, but it is a way of life. It really emphasizes, respect of elders, orders, order, a commitment to the community. The community is more important than you are. This sort of, um, overwhelming that things need to stay under control, and you as an individual need to relegate your interest to the interest of the greater good, sort of thing. Well, first of all, that's very different than this country. We're very a highly individualistic country. And then secondly, you can kind of undersee how that kind of Confucian mindset would play right into a communist philosophy, because that's basically, the fundamentals of communism. It's, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs, sort of thing. So if you look back, sort of their progression all kind of makes sense to me. But there's a couple of things going on that I think have really that I think there can be real problems for them going forward. The first are their demographics. They implemented the one child policy a long time ago. And so they are way ahead of most of where the rest of the world is on the demographic curve. I mean, the whole world, and this is something I find that most people don't realize or believe, or have not researched, but the world population is going to top out here in the next few decades. And then after that, we're in for a long-term decline, which, by the way, is going to have incredible fundamental repercussions on every institution that there is in the world. Um, some countries, Japan and China, have gotten there earlier than anybody else. If you go look at what's going on in Japan, which is further down the road than anybody else is, but also what's beginning to happen in China, and it's a real problem. And it's a real problem in terms if you think you're going to grow your economy, maybe not so much. The basic formula for GDP is population growth plus productivity. So if you got no population growth, then all you're left with is productivity. And for years we've been able to, for centuries really, the whole world has been able to count on the fact there's going to be more people to feed, more people that need cars, more people that need houses. All of that's about to end here in the next few decades. So China's facing a real demographic crisis going forward, and how they're going to manage that. I think also, autocracy has very severe limits. It can be very efficient in the short term, but in the long term, it tends not to be very efficient because it restricts the number of data inputs into making decisions. And I think that's why they got COVID so terribly wrong.
Mm.
There was this mindset that we're going to have zero COVID and we're going to make that a big deal, and then they couldn't back down from it. And them trying to admit that they've made a mistake is very, very difficult in any autocracy, really. And so, they pivoted on it very, very quickly, but only when the country was about to go in revolt. Again,
Yeah.
I think showing the sensitivity they have to this internal order and revolution and everything. And it's why they're so obsessed with controlling the population and what they see on the internet and all that kind of stuff. All that stuff works in the short term. It really doesn't work in the long term. And I think that this current Chinese government is going to have more and more problems as they go forward. I think the Chinese people kind of made a deal with the communists, which was that okay, look, we're all poor, we're starving, we live in mud huts, and so if you guys can create a better economy for us, we'll kind of let y'all run the government, and we'll let you do what you want to, and not really be very political. And that was probably a good bargain for the Chinese people at the time. But as economic growth begins to slow and more problems come, and the last group of the Chinese people don't get lifted up out of severe poverty. By the way, just say there's more people in China that don't have running water and sewer than live in the United States. So this is a country that still has a lot of development that they need to do, and as they sort of run out of money to do that, it's going to create more and more social and political tension inside the country. Now, in some ways, I worry that that makes them more dangerous because they may want to blame it all on the United States and go start a war over Taiwan or something. That's what, in some respects, I think that's what Putin did in Ukraine was. He was a lot of indications he's becoming less popular. So let's go start a foreign war to rally the nation and everything. It's not unheard of for autocrats to do that sort of thing. And so I worry a little bit about China, you know, falling to that temptation. Um, but I think that this idea that somehow they're going to be a huge military and economic power, they're going to take over the world, and they're going to. I think all that's just nonsense. I think that they're going to be really struggling in this coming century.
Let's take it a little bit stateside now. I was watching the GOP debate, and then I also um, forced myself to sit through most of the Tucker Carlson Trump interview. And a couple things came up related to China. I mean, I think the narrative and the debate is clearly, hey, the Ukraine war is actually being funded, and is somehow, this insinuation is like, hey, China's behind all of this. The second thing is that, China is the biggest threat to the U.S. And then in the Tucker Carlson interview, I even remember Trump saying, hey, you shouldn't buy an EV because the batteries are made in China. By the way, then we probably shouldn't buy phones either. But either way, there's clearly very little political capital to be gained by taking a more nuanced view in terms of U.S.-China relations. And quite the contrary, I think they really compete to be who can be tougher on China and make China out to be like this U.S.-China is black and white. There's a zero-sum game here. And as an optimist, I do wonder, like, man, is there not a way going forward that the U.S. and China can find a more productive relationship that where both sides win? Do you see any path for that?
Well, I mean, that's been where we've been on that path for the last 30 years.
Hmm.
I mean, people talk all the time about all the jobs that were shipped to China. There were some jobs that were outsourced, but the vast majority of manufacturing jobs we lost in the United States were due to robotics and better productivity. And we lost as many jobs in Mexico as we did to China. But what people say, well, we lost it. They'll go to a particular town. Well, these jobs were shipped off to China. How terrible it is! The town's a mess and all that. But the flip side of that is they all go to Walmart and buy cheap goods that were manufactured in China, and that doesn't bother them at all. So look, I'm a free trade kind of person. I think that I think trade helps the whole world increase the standard of living. That's not a popular view, although it was America's view for a long time. But I think there is a way that we could coexist and get along. Like there's something China does that are just they're out of line, and we need to push back hard on those. The way their whole deal about just wholesale stealing, intellectual property. That's not okay. That undermines I mean, the reason we have those laws is to encourage innovation. And to the extent you've got somebody that's undermining that, then they're undermining innovation. And so I think we need to push back hard on that sort of thing. I don't understand why they're able to do it as easily as they appear to be able to do it. You would think that by now Palo Alto and some of these guys would have figured out how to stop them from doing that, but I think we need to push back hard on that. I think that the way they're treating, I forgot what the ethnic group is, the Muslims,
Uyghurs,
yeah, the
Uyghurs.
Uyghurs. I think the way they're treating them is awful, and I think that America needs to stand up for that. But but at the same time, I think we've got to be candid that our country and certainly the British Empire has not had a great record in history on these same sorts of issues. I'm reading this really fascinating book right now called The Immortal Irishman. It's a biography of a guy named Tom Marr. And the first third of the book is devoted to how really awful the British treated the Irish. I mean, just,
Mm.
basically wholesale genocided back there in the mid 1800s during the potato famine.
Mm.
And so, look what China's doing is not exactly unprecedented in world history. It's more out of step with what norms are today than certainly they've been in the past. And we certainly shouldn't excuse it. And we ought to push back on it, and we ought to push for them to be more open. But at the same time, I think we need to realize that when you're pushing back on China and trying to get these things, it's kind of like pushing on an elephant to move. It's not only is it a huge country geographically and population, but it's also got 5,000 years of historical inertia. You know. That you're trying to overcome. We adapt new ideas and change and move and do things over here pretty rapidly because it's just been the history of our country. It's historically what's happened in this country, and so we're used to it. And we love change, and we love to get the new iPhone. It's got all the new stuff on it and everything. By the way, I don't know if y'all heard, but apparently the iPhone 15 is going to be out in the next couple 3 weeks, and it's going to have a USB-C port
Oh
instead
my
of a
goodness.
Lightning port. So
There's
I,
hope. There's hope for
I,
standardization.
I tweeted at Apple here not too long ago. I said, "I'm not buying another iPhone until you convert the iPhone to until you convert the port to USB-C." And they did it. So obviously, my
Well, you got
influence
some
with
clout,
Apple,
Phil.
yeah, it's been one of my pet peeves for a long time. But anyway, so I just don't think that they're used to things changing very fast. It's sort of contrary to the Confucian philosophy
Mm.
and or religion, whatever you want to call it. I mean, that's a conservative religion, conservative philosophy that is very suspect of change, worrying that it's going to lead to disorder and chaos and civil war and all those sorts of things. So I think we're going to have to sort of accept the fact that the Chinese pace of change is going to be different than ours. and it's going to be that doesn't mean we shouldn't stand up for what's right, but to think that we're going to go in there and intimidate them into doing something, you know, I think that's nonsense.
So, how do we reconcile the hypothesis that, hey, China's been on a multi-thousand-year journey? It's a giant country. It's not a place that's super agile that, turns on a dime, with the appearance that, wow, China is starting to um, make its presence more known internationally, like in Africa, or now, a lot of people are talking about the relationship with Cuba and some military coordination there. That does seem like an evolution of, the Middle Kingdom just focus inward kind of approach. What's your read on the motivation or the reality of expansion of Chinese interests?
Well, I think first of all, they've got some economic interests like precious metals, rare earth metals, and oil, and some of those things that they need to try to protect. I mean, if you were running China, you would be doing that, and so I think some of that is that. Some of it is because I think because the American rhetoric has become so anti-Chinese, and they watch what we do very carefully, that they feel like they kind of have to respond in kind, really out of sort of I think more a sense of national pride or gamesmanship or something. That's why I would really like to see the heat come down quite a bit. Um, I think it was Teddy Roosevelt that said that foreign policy should be speak softly and carry a big stick. And I really think that's what we need to do with China. I'm a big believer in the U.S. having the most robust, powerful military in the world. And but I think you ought to use it very sparingly, and I don't think you ought to run around threatening people with it a bunch. If you've got it, which by the way, if you read The Art of War, this is exactly what it says. You know, if you're weak, appear strong. If you're strong, appear weak. Or hide your strength.
Mm.
And I think to some extent, this is Xi Jinping taking a page out of The Art of War and saying, look how strong we are. We can go do all these things. We can fly a balloon over America, which is all kind of silly shit when you really get down to it. But it gives the appearance of strength, which masks the really fundamental weaknesses and problems that his country is facing right now. So I think a lot of it's just sort of, machismo.
Mm. I was
By the way,
having.
let me talk
Go ahead.
about the militaries.
Hmm.
Let me just tell you, the United States military, compared to any other military in the world, it's like the major leagues and the minor leagues.
Hmm.
There's not anybody that has a military that is even vaguely uh, able to compete with the U.S. military. I'll give you one example. There's 17 nuclear aircraft carriers in the world. The United States has 14 of them. We have, our technology, and I think we're seeing it in Ukraine. We've taken a country that's what, a third of Russia's size, and obviously not nearly the resources, and we've basically armed them and given them the tactics and organization to fight off this huge country that was trying to invade them. And that was really military. It was really U.S. military technology, tactics, strategy, and everything that's been put in place over there. And so I think it just gives you an example. If NATO, if the United States was fighting Russia, that war would have been over in about 3 days.
Hmm. Yeah, I think most Americans do believe that the U.S. military is for sure the strongest in the world. I think there has been in the past rhetoric that the cupboards are bare, that the Democratic Party has purposely hollowed out the U.S. military, and that now China's gonna surpass us. I don't think the facts line up with that, but the rhetoric is very powerful. if you're, running for a Republican primary or
Well, I
something,
mean,
right?
you show the military expenditures. It's a
Yeah.
little misleading because we pay our military a lot more than they pay theirs, but still, the look they've got. I think it's 14,000 miles of border or something like that. I don't remember what the number was. They've got some huge length of border. Maybe it's 8,000 miles, and that are and there's not really anybody on the other side of those borders that are all that friendly to them. And
Hmm.
so they've got to protect. We don't have any threats on our border. I mean, unless you call poor immigrants traipsing across the Rio Grande a threat, and it's a problem, but I wouldn't call it a threat like facing off against Russia on the other side of a border, or India on the other side of a border, or Vietnam on the other side of a border, which hates them. Um, so they've got a lot more security interests than we do in terms of what they've got to protect. The one advantage that they have is that the United States is, regardless whether we say we want to be it or not, we really are the world's police officer. And so we've got to sort of have coverage over the entire globe. China
Hmm.
is really pretty much focused just on Southeast Asia, and so it is it is much more. Um, uh, it's much more. It can focus where it spends its military much more than we're able to. I mean, we got to maintain a big force in Europe and Korea and a lot of other places.
I would love to also, this is a good visualization of, you were referring to
Yeah.
aircraft carriers. We
Uh-huh.
definitely have a few more than pretty much everyone else combined. So I think we're not exactly completely bare covered. Our cupboards aren't completely bare.
No,
Um,
a
yeah,
war between the United States and anybody else in the world would last a few days.
yeah.
It would be over and nothing flat. And I tell you, if you don't believe that, go back and look at the Iraq War. And if you recall, when Iraq was trying to invade Kuwait, and they
Hmm.
finally gave up and started leaving the country, the United States caught that long column of
Oh
army
yeah,
on that
yeah.
highway. Remember that?
Hmm.
And they sent in some A-10 warthogs, and in a matter of a few hours, they completely destroyed the Iraqi army. It's
Yeah.
really incredible devastation. Now think about when Russia invaded Ukraine, and they had that 50-mile convoy caught on that highway.
Hmm.
Yep. If the U.S. military say, you know what, we're going to get involved in this right now, that entire convoy would have been destroyed in a matter of hours. You know,
Yeah.
so the idea that somehow, like we spend a lot of money on the military, and I'm never for writing them a blank check or any of those kind of things, but at the same time, the idea that somehow our military has been depleted and we can't, project force into almost any place in the world against anybody else, I think is pretty much nonsense.
Yeah, I will say that I agree with you that watching the Iraq War, I mean, that was not even that. It felt like it only took a few days to defeat the the Iraqi army and the elite Republican Guard and all those guys. I will say that occupying another country is very hard. You know,
Absolutely. Yeah,
um, yeah.
that's a different problem. And it's sort of interesting to me is America's never been a big occupier.
Mm,
We go off and win wars and give the countries back.
right, right.
You know.
Yeah, yeah. I do want to pivot a little bit to a topic that I I have a personal interest in, which is the future of Chinese Americans in the United States. I was kidding, only half kidding, with one of my friends at dinner a few months ago, and I was like, "Man, the temperature is rising on the U.S.-China rhetoric," and I'm not entirely sure that people discern the difference between Chinese Americans, especially folks like me who were born and raised here, and come from family backgrounds of persecution by the current mainland Chinese party in power, and the Chinese that they hear about on the news flying balloons and going mining minerals and things like that in Africa. And I'm wondering, do you think there is a risk that there could be some blurring of the lines? And it wasn't that long ago that we put Japanese Americans in in camps and things like that, or do you think maybe, hey, come on, it's 2023, like we're beyond that. We're a little bit more nuanced as a country.
Like I think it's a very small percentage of the country that harbors those kinds of prejudices, um, and I think that the greatest antidote to prejudice is acquaintance.
Mm,
I always thought that the what really sort of changed America's attitude about gay people were gay people coming out.
mm,
You know, and they came out. And people said, "Oh, wait a minute, that guy's a friend of mine. He's gay. Well, I kind of like him." And so I think that, and look, the Chinese community is heavily embedded all through the United States. We have a huge community here in Houston. You see them on, as commentators on all sorts of network programs. So I don't. The problem is even a small group of people that harbor some sort of you know delusional prejudice about those things can do harm. They can
mm-hmm.
show up and bomb churches and shoot a bunch of people or someplace. So I think there's that risk of those sorts of isolated violence that could possibly take place. But I think on the whole, I don't see it. We have a Chinese state representative here, and I see a lot of people beating him up, but they're beating him up not because he's Chinese, but because he's a very liberal, progressive Democrat. I don't hear anybody saying, let's throw him out because he's Chinese.
Mm.
So,
Yeah, well, I hope you're right. I think, and I think you are. I think the majority of most Americans are know or have positive interactions with Chinese Americans. I do agree that there is a fringe out there that sometimes can be misled to get, and they think they're acting in the country's best interest. Then obviously we saw January
well,
6th,
we have a we have
what
a we
people.
have a, we have a word for that called scapegoat.
Yeah, 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 yeah,
You sacrifice the goat for your sins, and
yeah, yeah.
and I think right now China is a scapegoat for the United States. I mean, let's just take every problem. We have all these problems, most of which are self-inflicted, and let's blame them on somebody else, especially if you're a political leader.
Yeah.
Let's why would I try to deal with the fact that the opioid crisis probably did more to hollow out the Midwest than moving jobs to China did. So let's
Mm,
just blame it all on China. We got a fentanyl crisis in the United States. Well, that's China's fault. Has nothing to do with the people that take it here all the time and buy it like crazy. It's all China's fault for And so I think scapegoating goes back
yeah.
that term goes back to ancient uh, Israel and Jewish
Yeah.
tradition.
Biblical times.
Yeah, and so
Yeah.
that's been around for a long time, and politicians are always going to do it. So there's always a risk to that. One of the things I thought was quite fascinating was the fact that this this recent litigation over racial quotas to major universities was brought by Asians.
Mm,
Those lawsuits were, and there was all this sort of progressive angst about. Wait a second, they're supposed to be on our side. Why are they siding with the other side? And I thought it was kind of funny. I've actually found the Asian community to be pretty diverse in its political views. Obviously, it varies some from community to community, but there's a big Texas Asian Republican Party club here in Texas. It's very active, and when I ran for mayor, that was one of the groups you absolutely went and talk to. The
mm,
Vietnamese had a big club here, and in Houston, we have two Vietnamese communities. We have the ones that came over from the at the end of the war and their children who hate the current Vietnam. Then we have some that have immigrated since then, think we ought to get along with Vietnam. And so you have the two sides fighting like crazy. So,
yeah. 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 My mom reminds me a lot of kind of the older generation Cuban Americans. Like she really does not
mhm,
like mainland China at
mhm.
all, and has very strong feelings about it. I do feel like the Democratic Party hasn't maybe worked as hard to earn the loyalty or support of Asian American voters. I think they probably focus on other other topics and other constituencies. Do you see a path where, as the Asian American populations grow, that the parties will kind of pay a little more attention to them, or is it just the numbers? It's just still too small.
Well, the numbers are getting up there to be significant. Every ethnic community in the United States, other than African Americans, suffer in this two party system because they don't block vote. You know, African
Mm-hmm.
Americans, 90% of that community is typically going to vote one direction. You
Mm-hmm.
know, and there's history and cultural reasons for that. But when you get to Asians or even Latinos or Indians or any other group, they tend not to be that monolithic. And so if you're running a political campaign, do I spend my money trying to turn out a group where I know I'm going to get 90 cents on the dollar back, or do I go
Mm-hmm.
spend money on a group where I might get as many no votes as I get yes votes? And so I think that's one of the reasons why you don't see a lot of emphasis by either political party on some of these other communities. Republicans are working hard right now on the Latino vote because
Mm-hmm.
Latinos are they're culturally conservative people for the most part, and they agree with the Republicans on a lot of social issues. And so the Republicans see that as a opportunity. Their immigration, it's at odds with their whole theory on immigration and the way they treat immigrants and everything. But that's the one place where I see a lot of outreach going. But I think the Democrats have gotten lazy, and and I think they take the African American community for granted.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're beginning to see some cracks in that support even there. I recently wrote a piece about abortion and what that's doing to the Republican Party. And I ended with a quote from a friend of mine that says the only thing that's keeping the Republican Party propped up is how god awful the Democrats are. And I think that's where we are in this country. It's just neither party represents their platforms don't represent a worldview that's consistent with the vast majority of Americans. And so you those of us that are in the middle end up going to the polls every 4 years and saying which is the less of the two evils, which is the less crazy person on the ballot.
Well, Bill, I know we're running up on time, but I also realize it's late August of 2023. We have a presidential election cooking up. It's a crazy time for the first time ever. We've had a former president booked and mugshotted and out on bail and with multiple indictments. And then you've got on the other side a sitting president who's not super popular. What's your take on this coming election? Like, what do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think absent one of the two leading candidates having some kind of health crisis, which is obviously possible with either one of them, given their age and especially Trump's physical condition. Um, I think it's going to be a rematch between Biden and Trump, and I think Biden will beat him pretty easily. That's what I'm expecting. I don't think the indictments. I know that's all the press loves to talk about that, and they take great relish you know, um, in Schadenfreude and Trump being indicted. But the truth of the matter is, I just don't think they move the needle very much. Three of the cases, and look, I'm not a Trump person at all, just so everybody will know out
Hmm.
there. I think he's an awful human being, and every single thing my mom and dad taught me about how I'm supposed to live my life is exactly opposite of the way Donald Trump lives his life. So I don't take this as any kind of as a signal of any kind of Trump support. But three of the four cases, in my mind, are really pretty much bullshit. The one case down in Florida on the documents case, I think, is a serious case, and he should be convicted on that. But at the same time, other people have done similar things, not as bad as what he did, but similar things, and skated on it. And so all four of those cases are sort of politically um, undermined in terms of what the effect they might have are. And so I'm not sure that's going to matter. Look, my belief is, I'm looking at presidential elections for a long time. It's what Bill Clinton said. It's the economy, stupid. And so I think if you want to think about who's going to win the presidential election in November of 24, you got to think about what's the economy likely to look like in November of 2024. And my guess is the economy is probably going to be pretty good then. The Probably going to see the Fed start reducing interest rates in the spring of 24, which will lead to some economic growth, better stock market, and all that. We've already got super low unemployment. If they start lowering interest rates, it'll be because they've gotten inflation under control. So if we go into the fall with lower interest rates, good employment, inflation down, I think it's very hard to beat any incumbent president in that situation. Again, absent some disclosure about Hunter that we haven't heard of, or a health problem or something like that. I think it's a rematch, and Biden probably wins by a significantly bigger margin than he did in 20.
Yeah, I think my nightmare scenario is that Biden gets the nomination and then has a health issue after getting the nomination, and then it's already Biden Harris as the ticket. And then if that's the official ticket, and then Biden has to pull out for health reasons, I don't know if Harris how she would do up against Trump.
Well, I think the question is whether she would be the presidential candidate in that situation or not.
Yeah.
As I recall, remember this happened with McGovern. Remember Eagleton? There was a mental health crisis. This
yeah, he wept.
One of the benefits of being old. You remember all this shit.
Yeah. Is he the one that wept on camera or something, and that was like a big deal, or is that a different guy?
It could be. I don't know.
Yeah.
They discovered that Eagleton had gone through some depression and
mental health stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and he'd been they'd used shock therapy on him, which was what I think really got everybody's attention. And so he got removed from the ticket. I'm trying to think who they replaced him with. I don't know how it would, but anyway. So that happened, and that was after the convention. And my recollection is that the way a candidate is replaced, if they have to withdraw, is that the party executive committee gets together and decides who that's going to be. And so in that situation, you would have basically the party insiders deciding who's going to be the nominee. And I think they probably don't pick her, because I would guess the polling would be pretty bad on her. And so maybe you pick somebody like your governor out in California or somebody like that,
Yeah.
The ticket.
I would find a Newsom-Whitmer combo quite interesting. I worry that if that happened, Democratic turnout might be affected in terms of would black voters say, "Oh my God, she's a vice president. She served by his side loyally."
Well, I think they'll leave her on the ticket. A Newsom-Harris
ticket.
Yeah, that's what I would predict. Yeah.
I see. So she would remain on the ticket. Okay, so we just swap out Biden for Newsom. That would be fine with me. Or Whitmer Harris would be fine. What do you think of Whitmer? She seems very reasonable.
Yeah. I think, look, I'm not a fan of any of this current crop of politicians, because I just hate the way they all pander to the primary voters. It just makes my stomach turn. I like Manchin, I like Hogan, I like some of those guys who really have sort of charted a centrist kind of course. But it's just not time for that right now.
Yeah, I mean,
we need to have. But.
Yeah, like Hogan and Youngkin, like they are not welcome in the Republican Party today. It doesn't seem.
Ronald Reagan wouldn't be welcome.
Yeah, they'd probably call him a rhino. They probably would.
For sure, no question. I mean, he did the last, amnesty.
All
those rapists coming across the border.
Yeah, I remember in the Republican debates in the past, if you quoted Reagan, it's automatic applause line.
Right.
But the last week or a few days ago, this past week, Anytime the city upon the hill, peace through strength, that did not land at all with that audience. It was just silence.
I'll never forget. James Baker wrote a essay here. This was 4 or 5 years ago about needing to return civility back to politics. And I'm a big James Baker fan, know him personally, and so I wrote a little op-ed and put it out and linked to his speech. And I got all these emails back from current Republicans
Mm-hmm.
telling me how James Baker was a traitor to the Republican Party and he was a rhino and all that.
Mm.
And I'm like, do you not realize that if it weren't for the Bushes and Baker, there wouldn't be a Republican Party in
Yeah,
Texas?
yeah, yeah,
And what exactly have you done?
yeah, yeah. I've heard people say Dick Cheney's a rhino as well. I'm like, man, he's many
Well,
things, but he's not a rhino.
well, I think it's because he stood up for his daughter.
Yeah. By the way, I looked up on the internet, and so McGovern and Eagleton. McGovern was on top of the ticket. Eagleton had to be replaced by McGovern by Sargent Shriver.
Exactly, Sergeant
There you go.
Shriver. Yeah.
I,
I remember I
I,
saw Sergeant Shriver give a speech at U of H. This is when I was in college. And I'll never forget, he got up and his big applause line was because, McGovern was a bomber pilot in World War II. And Sergeant Shriver was in the submarine corps in
mm,
World War II. And he got up and said, where is the gunpowder on the Republican candidates, ticket, or the sin of gunpowder or something like that. I got a huge applause line because they were the
mm,
only two that actually were veterans that had seen, combat.
that is that reminds me. Remember the Swift boat stuff?
Yeah. Uh huh.
That was pretty incredible how the Republicans were able to turn the Democratic ticket into somehow not being like loyal to the country and being willing to serve when the Democratic ticket had the only guy who actually, took enemy fire, literally. But
Yeah. Of course,
but that's politics for you.
that whole campaign was run out of Houston. I don't know if you know that or not. There's a
Oh,
very well-known Houston trial lawyer here who organized that whole Swift boat campaign, and he had been over there in Vietnam, and uh, he hated him. I mean, just hated him. And it was based on some things that had happened over there and some things that happened after they all got back and everything. But he was the one that
uh,
organized that and wrote the book and everything.
yeah. Crazy. Well, I guess Kerry did get his comeuppance. Like, I mean, he had a pretty big milestone with the Paris climate accord. So, luckily he was able to kind of stay on the stage in a way.
Yeah.
So with that, I think I'm going to ask one last question, Bill, that came out in the comment in the live chat, which I think you touched on a little bit. I think you're pretty bearish on China's economic future, that the narrative that China is going to take over the whole world economy and then just, colonize everybody. Like, it sounds like you're not holding your breath.
I think that they've got some very serious challenges.
Yeah.
I think the current Chinese government is exacerbating the problem. If you go back and look at Chinese, per capita GDP,
Mm-hmm.
it was flat for a long, long time. And when it started its meteoric rise, it was with the market reforms that they introduced over there. I mean, look, the market works. I mean,
Yeah.
it's the greatest generator of wealth that there is. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't regulate, and I'm not arguing any of that. And, every market's got to be regulated and so forth. But if your fundamental economic system is based on, um, a market-based economy, it's going to produce a lot of wealth and a great standard of living for people. And when you look at Chinese, if you go back and just put up a chart of Chinese per capita GDP, you'll see that it started up when who was it?
Deng Xiaoping.
Don Xiaoping, yeah. began to introduce those economic reforms. And a few years after he did that, man, it took off.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is pretty. I'm not a huge fan of the CCP, but I got to give them credit. They probably took a lot of people out of poverty
For
based
sure.
on their policies.
No, I mean there's
Um,
no question when they
yeah.
adopted those market-based policies back in the late '80s, early '90s, they set a whole. They set 1.5 billion people loose to go create and do things,
Mm-hmm.
and look, they are very industrious people, and there's a whole interesting theory about the difference between cultivating rice versus wheat. I don't know if you've ever read any of this, but
Oh no.
yeah, it's another big difference between the United States and Western democracies and China. The cultivation of rice requires a real intensity, and then
Mm.
uh, and year-round care. Where if you're cultivating wheat and corn, it's basically a half year, and then you're kind of off. And anyway, how that's fed into the cultural and philosophical differences between those cultures that cultivate rice and ones that don't.
Yeah, that is. It's not an easy crop.
Right, for sure, for sure.
Here's an interesting chart on the people often talk about the total GDP of China, but the per capita GDP, people, I think there's this impression that Chinese are as wealthy as Americans and going to surpass us, and they're just like crushing everything. And, it's still a very poor country given how many people they have. And once you come out of the cities, it's not exactly like the suburbs of Houston or Palo Alto.
I said this earlier. There's as many people in China without
Hmm.
sanitary sewer and water systems as live in the United States.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
it's overall it's a very poor country. Now, it's not as poor as some African countries, and some of those clearly better off than them, but it's kind of in the middle of the pack. You know?
yeah, yeah. Well, Bill, it's been a pleasure having you back in the Nerd Zone, and I would love to get you back on soon to talk about what you think about third parties, your take on the forward party, no labels, that kind of thing. But we'll have to save that for the next visit.
We'll be happy to do that with you someday.
All right,
Good to
Bill.
see you, Tom. Thanks everybody for sitting in on this.
Yeah, it's been great. Talk to you later. Bye,
Bye.
nerds. All right, Bill King. I'm going to give you my closing thoughts on that conversation. And, oh, sorry, Soldier One. We missed your question, but let me take a stab at my point of view, and then we'll try and get Bill back in the future to talk about his take on China's approach to climate change. I think China is not doing enough on climate change for sure. I think it comes into conflict with what Bill and I were just talking about, which is they still have a ton of people that are in poverty and certainly not in their middle class. And so to say to them, hey, look, you've got to switch over to renewable energy that is financially not as efficient in the short term, because the whole planet needs everybody to pitch in. I think they struggle with that. I think they would say, well, look, Europe and the US poured, tons of coal and burned tons of coal and oil and got to a better place. And even you still don't want to go renewable, as you heard from Vivek Ramaswamy. One of his core beliefs is that humans must burn fossil fuel to prosper. So, yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, as a human, I hope China does way more. But as an observer of China policy, let's look at the data, because this is Nerds for Humanity. We got to do it. Their carbon emissions over time, it has certainly is flattened, let's call it. There's their GDP. Where's their health, infant mortality? What the carbon? Control F. Okay, so they've done better per capita in their carbon emissions. So they're still producing more per capita. Oh, actually similar to Japan and less than Russia. And it's kind of flattened out here, as you can see. But I think the problem is they have a lot of capita. So, if you think about their total carbon production, here's a better chart. It's still, well, this is again per capita. Well, let's see. Total China carbon emissions. Okay, here we go. So it's still going up, even though per capita has flattened out. So it looks like they made some efforts in 2010 that have definitely kept it from, look at it going from 2002 to 2010 is like a vertical line. But then it's starting to go up again since 2017. So, let's say if we compare total China carbon emissions versus USA over time. China's greenhouse gas. Okay, so it produces more greenhouse gas than all of the developed world. So they need to do more. Now they would say, hey, we're trying. We have people in poverty. We have people living without power. It's very cost effective for us to build a coal plant versus trying to build, nuclear or solar or wind or something like that. So I think we're going to have to, it's a tough one. It's a little bit like incentives conflict, where if you're running China and you want to stay in power, you probably are not going to do it by becoming greener. You probably are going to do it by increasing the standard of living for people living today. Now, future generations may say, hey, you kind of really screwed up the planet. But, I think China has a little bit of that drill baby drill vibe to it, unfortunately. And I think the only way we all force China's hand is if the developed countries led by the U.S. say, look, we're not down with buying all these Chinese products if your carbon emissions is not more under control. That would not be easy for us to say, because when you go to Walmart, imagine everything's twice as expensive. Because if you're not going to buy it from China, you got to buy it from somewhere else, and very few other places can produce things at scale and at the cost that the Chinese can. So, yeah, it's a great question, Soldier One. Let me do a couple things. I'm going to thank the people who make this channel possible, and then I'm going to give you 5 takeaways from my conversation with Bill King about China. But first, we got to thank the people. The channel members. If you've been thinking about becoming a member and you do it in the next 10, 20 seconds, you get a shout out from me right now. Or you can join on replay and you'll get a shout out in my next live stream, which will probably be in a week's time. So we're going to start with our biggest supporter, And we all know who that is. That is none other than the man who just asked a question, and that is Soldier One. He is a senior vice president and has been supporting this content for 40 months. And all of our channel members basically helped me pay for our podcast hosting fees and streaming software. So thank you for doing that. VPs, we got Bike and Kristen Slevin. Kristen Slevin has been supporting this channel financially for 43 months. So thank you, Kristen. And then Hardcore is right under that level, under Kristen and Bike. It's Gene, David, DK, Jekalego, Kirsch, Mr. History, Mona, Von, Yang, Dean, Galessa, J. Perrin, Dana, Jason, Daniel, Mickey, and Unkio. And then at the verified level, we have Lisa, Brandon, Sophia, Doris, Emerald, Ben, Ira, Elizabeth, Shoni, Dr. William, Karen, Mai, Brittany, Lori, Wana, Kevin, T, Jeremy, David, Nicholas, Mike, Zig, Roberto, and Jackson. So let's talk about the key takeaways. 5 things about US-China conversation with Bill King. I think number 1 is most people do not have nearly the understanding of Chinese history that folks like Bill and others who've studied this have. And if you do, like everything in life, it becomes more complicated and more gray and more nuanced. It is not as simple as China is evil and is trying to take everything from everyone else. It's also not as simple as China's just perfectly like a saint and they're just completely misunderstood. It's definitely in the middle. The second thing is that we are probably overstating the threat from China, that they have their own issues. But, you know, it's not to say that they aren't a major, you know, economic kind of frenemy of ours. We rely on their cheap goods, basically. And unless we're going to change our lifestyles, and as well as diversify our supply chain, the idea of the American kind of modern lifestyle without products from China is hard to imagine. So we're going to have to find a way to work with them. And I think the third is maybe this notion that the U.S. military is completely like a paper tiger and, you know, we have no bullets and our cupboards are empty. I think that's just politicians trying to scare people to vote for them in a party primary. Number 4 is I think neither party is likely to come up with a win-win. When I talked to Bill about, well, what's the win-win? He said, well, we've had it where it's been trade with China and we benefit from their ability to produce goods at a very low cost and decent quality these days, including many of the phones that we use and toys and clothes and shoes and God knows what else. But I do think that introduces other problems, which is like, okay, well then what do the 300 million Americans do for work if everything's being produced overseas? You'd have to replace it with service jobs, technology innovation, maybe basic income. But that's a complicated world. Ask anybody who watched Andrew Yang kind of struggle in the 2016 election. And then my last takeaway from my conversation with Bill is positive. I think he was less concerned about potential acts of violence against Chinese Americans. I think he acknowledged that, well, you know, you're going to have fringe people all the time. I mean, my concern is if those kind of easily influenced, maybe not super stable people are hearing political leaders pound on the table that China's, you know, our biggest threat in destroying this country. If those people run into someone who looks like me on the street, I hope they differentiate and be like, okay, well, he's not trying to destroy this country. And at a minimum, ideally, you would hope that they take a more nuanced view of what China's trying to do and their history and incentives as well. But hopefully you found this conversation interesting. If you did, do me a solid and so more people discover it. Share it out to your social media. Comment below if there are other kind of deep policy, deep dives. I know we're going to do a lot of state of the political campaign type content, but if there are policy things that you want me to go deeper into, I can try and find experts, like maybe someone on climate or renewable energy. I think that would be really fun. And lastly, thanks again to all the people who are members of the channel. Click that join link if you're watching on YouTube and you want to keep this content going. With that, I'll say goodbye, nerds.